Hi, everyone, and welcome to the week ahead. I'm Tony Nash. Today, we're joined by two new guests. We've got Ross Kennedy. You may know Ross as Huntsman on Twitter. He's with Fortis Analysis. And we've got Ralph Schoellhammer. Ralph is at Webster, Vienna Private University. And we have the honor of having Marko with us again today. So there's a lot that's happened really over the past couple of years around supply chains. And we're going to kick off talking about supply chains in 2023. And Ross is going to lead us on that. Next, we're going to look at China. There have been some claims made about kind of existential claims made about China over the past couple of weeks. And Albert's going to walk us through those. And then finally, Rolf is going to help us talk about German energy and German dependence on Russian gas. So let's get into it, guys. Thanks for joining us, Ross. You know, I've seen a lot on Twitter. You're talking quite a lot about supply chains, and in 20 and 21, you really opened a lot of our eyes to some of those issues. So I've wanted to have you on the show for a long time, and you know, on the screen right now, I've got a chart of sea freight rates, Asia to U.S. West Coast sea freight rates. And those obviously ballooned up in 21, came back down in 22, and we're kind of now down to about where we were in Q1 of 20. So, you know, the last 4 months things have really started to calm down in terms of the costs. But I guess really what I want to get into with you is, are supply chain risks a thing of the past? You know, what should we be looking for in 2023? I guess let's just start with that. Are they a thing of the past, and what should we be looking for in supply chains in 23?
Yeah, I think supply chains have changed in terms of the scope of risk. Certainly, it shifted from one to the other. We had a short-term risk that was very systemic as far as manufacturing in China being completely disrupted, the ability to ship out. And then we had the entire issue of people changing their buying habits, you know, basically by force, as far as lockdowns, from a lot of events, a lot of entertainment, a lot of things where their dollars are being spent on not physical things that actually have to be shipped. And all of a sudden, everybody took that spending, they took the stimulus money, and they just began buying things that were feathering their nest or occupying their attention. And so you had the disruption not only of lockdowns, not only of that, but you had this very enormous shift in purchasing from experiences or non-tangible things to physical things that have to be shipped. That's why you saw the run up in stock for Amazon and numerous others. It was because people were doing that, right? So we had this enormous crunch that was driven by that fundamentally. And now we've seen we have the bullwhip effect. Inventories were dramatically overordered, and now we've got inflation happening. So inventories are full and demand is down, particularly on the Trans-Pacific trade to the West Coast of the U.S. from China. What we have seen, though, is that there has been container volume shifted to the Gulf. It's also shifted to the East Coast because we've had the risk really since July of last year of longshoreman strikes. And then you have the concurrent risk of rail strikes coming off the West Coast. So we have seen some volume that's still in play shift, but depending on who you are as a company will determine if that has actually, your supply chain problems have begun to unwind a little bit, or if they have really only begun, or if they've just changed as far as what they are. If you're a retailer in the US, you really just started shipping over the East Coast if you're concerned about West Coast risk and you still have to move inventory. But that's assuming that now the lockdown, no lockdown, back to lockdown, and now no lockdown again with people out sick right in front of the Chinese New Year, if that hasn't dramatically impacted your business. There are some sectors that have been heavily hit by that hard. The impact is less to China in some ways because they're heavily subsidized in a lot of their industries. The impact is more so, I think, felt by the U.S. And I know Albert will talk about, the China side of that factor. But what we've seen now is a dramatic disruption really to the way things are, not in a foreseeable way, not in a way that a lot of people know how to forecast, in a very, I would say, very unexpected way where you've got this sort of, well, not unexpected to this group, but unexpected to a lot of supply chain and planners and executives of they went from huge amounts of demand to very little demand due to inflation here in the U.S. And then you also have the supply side disruption, in Asia. So that's sort of the twin monsters that a lot of North American companies and European companies are dealing with related to planning their supply chains.
So we have it sounds to me like we have a couple things in general that are helping to alleviate this. First is price, right? Things are more expensive. And so that's pushing down demand on a volume basis. But we also have China opening up. And so that is alleviating supply chains on the supply side. So it's those two dynamics that seem to be really helping us into 23. Have we also seen, I know there's been a lot of talk about this, but to what extent are we seeing rotation of manufacturing locations? Is that a major effect, or are we in the early stages of that?
I think we're in the very early stages of it. It takes multiple years if you're going to uproot a semiconductor foundry, for example, which everybody's made a big deal about the CHIPS Act and all of that. And I think Nancy Pelosi had a great run financially because of that for a while. But it takes 3 to 4 years, even 5 years from soup to nuts, be able to get the process of moving something halfway around the world from one location to another. You have to make a lot of things before you can install them and then begin making chips. Other things that are able to transition very quickly are doing so. Things that are fungible, where you're essentially reprogramming a machine to print a T-shirt from, in China versus Vietnam. That stuff is already shifting. You're already seeing demand pick up for things like garments and textiles in Southeast Asia and India and Bangladesh. Pakistan also has gained a little bit on the textile side, but things that are energy intensive to manufacture, things that require critical raw materials or certain types of inputs that China does very well. We'll probably talk a little bit about Zeihan's hypothesis with regards to China, but China is very dominant in a lot of raw material sectors, and assuming they continue to have the energy and labor available, it's going to be a lot slower to ship that type of stuff away from China. But things that can shift are you're seeing more tires produced outside of China again, for example. So again, it's very sector dependent, and a lot of people want to make projections or economic plans or suggestions about the way things are on a macro scale without really understanding that in certain ways China still very much holds the whip hand, and you won't see manufacturing shift. In other ways, you're seeing it shift very rapidly away from China, and that'll have an impact on them as well.
Okay, so let's take a step back to say 2019. Okay, we had Trump, who was trying to get different things out of China and bring things to the U.S. and reduce China's centrality or centricity to supply chains. And then we have COVID come in, and that really disrupts supply chains. And then there's this wake-up call for people to kind of regionalize manufacturing, right? So this reminds me a lot of, say, 2007-8, when it started with Japanese companies doing a China plus one, China plus two, China plus three strategy, right? And so, so that's happening again. But after we got through the financial crisis, everyone just was like, China's easy, let's just go back and do that. Are we going to see that again? Are people just going to kind of shrug shoulders at the end of the day and go, people are inherently lazy. I don't want to have to do the work to have 3 different sites to manufacture this stuff. So, let's just put it back in China. Is that likely to happen, or was this wake-up call the one that really pushes people to have resiliency in their supply chain?
I think, again, from a sector dependent standpoint, it's yes and no. To the extent that if the primary stakeholder of a company is the U.S., let's say a Honeywell, for example, they will have to pull out. U.S. policies we have reached a point that even if the U.S. has, if a company is U.S. based and they're like, we're going to still try to manufacture there for whatever reason, it is too much of a lift to pull out of there. In a lot of respects, Xi Jinping has a vote on that too. If he wants a company out, or if he wants to just seize that company's manufacturing capacity or whatever, he'll do it, right? So there is always the bad guy as it were always has a vote on how the fight goes too. So that is one group of companies that very much can be expected to either leave on their own or be forced out. In other sectors where a company can be co-opted or the U.S. isn't really paying attention, I think you'll see the impetus to just kind of try to hunker down and ride out this 10-year sort of economic Cold War, if you will, in their mind. They'll do that as well. But again, so many of the unknowns that are driven here are the fact that China has a vast ability, if it chooses to leverage its own strategic advantages to push us around, to anchor companies there if they want to kick them out if they choose to. And that, for whatever reason, really outside of a relatively small group of, NatSec types and people that do analysis really well, they're not discussing what the calculus is on the other side. They're just discussing what the U.S. may or may not be able to do through our own policy.
Right.
At the end of the day, particularly when it comes to energy, anything that's super energy intensive to manufacture, it's not attractive to reshore to the U.S. right now because the Biden administration, the Department of Energy, particularly FERC, they're not going to get out of the way. And they have not, proven to do that. So we're not going to be able to make the fertilizers and fuels that we need to if we are continuing to drive them away with terrible energy policy and drive the price of energy sky high.
And as a Texan, I will tell you, we have all the raw materials here, right? Like there's no reason for us not to do that. A lot of Americans may not like Texans, but generating wealth here really does help all of America, right? So,
in my view, particularly when you talk about the Gulf, the raw capacity is there from a transportation side, from a labor side, from a raw materials side, particularly energy, to turn the South, Mid-South, all the way down to the Gulf into a manufacturing mega region that would be one of the great economic success stories of all time anywhere in the world. And that's a policy issue. It's certainly not a capability or capacity issue.
Yeah, the problem with that is the EPA. It makes a lot of manufacturing in the United States inefficient and uneconomical. Just something. We can't get around it. That's the problem.
Okay. And Europe has done very well with a lot of that stuff as well too. But again, it's subsidized in Europe. Some of those offsets, if you will, they're heavily subsidized, and so the companies don't bear that burden to the extent that they would in the U.S., where that type of thing is just as heavily regulated and penalized with zero subsidy.
Right. So since we're talking about supply chains mostly into the U.S., since Ralph is here, let's talk a little bit about Germany. Ralph, we've seen German politicians go to China over the past couple of months, and German heads of industry go to China and kind of almost double down on their commitment to China and double down on their dependency. And it almost feels like Germany is having the opposite conversation from a policy perspective that the U.S. is, in terms of the U.S. is trying to reduce its dependence on China. It seems like Germany is just going all in. Is that a misread? What's going on there?
Well, yes and no. There have been voices now in Germany getting louder, particularly when it came, for example, to the Chinese buying parts of the harbor in Hamburg or a German chip producer. So there are some voices that are getting more critical. But overall, the Chinese market is still crucial for German exports. So kind of when the German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock was in Asia a couple of months ago, and she said, we will stand side by side with Taiwan in the case of a conflict, that kind of was immediately backpedaled by other German parliamentarians who said, well, the Taiwanese didn't ask for our support, so we have no intention to give them our support. So I guess it would be very similar to the Russia-Ukraine thing. In a sense, I think what's always very important when we look at particularly German foreign policy, they are not really for or against someone. They primarily want to maintain the status quo. So they want to maintain as much as they can the 1990s, early 2000s status quo. That is true in the Asian case. It's also true in the case with Russia and Ukraine, right? Because some people say, why are the Germans not more supportive of Ukraine, or are they all in the pockets of the Russians? I don't think that's the case. I think German policy is to maintain a status quo when it comes to exports in China, when it comes to energy with Russia, and everything that quote unquote disturbs the peace is seen as a nuisance. And they usually kind of bet on the party that they hope can end that nuisance as quick as possible. And that, I think, was a little bit the miscalculation in the Russia case, that they originally believed that this is going to be a war, like Georgia like other earlier conflicts, that this is going to end very, very quickly.
Right.
With,
and we can all pretend
Ukraine.
it didn't happen, right? If it ends quickly,
exactly,
we can pretend it didn't happen.
Precisely.
You've got a few
And that
German
didn't
companies
happen.
too that are like leading indicators of German behavior with regards to China. BASF is one of them. Not only is BASF not recognizing its potential position of dominance on the vitamin and specialty chemical side, it's actually doubling down on China and expanding its manufacturing operations there, not retracing from it. And if you look at Mercedes, for example, I love Mercedes-Benz as a company, and I think they make some of the most amazing machines in the world. But you're not going to tell Mercedes, get the hell out of China. They'll do it if they choose to, but they have got such a deep investment there.
Mercedes can't.
And
Volkswagen can't either.
And as a quick second point of this, I mean, the German energy plan, we're going to talk about this a little later in more detail, but they still want to double down, particularly on solar and wind. And they need China as a partner to have good relations with China because they control most of the supply chains in these areas. So as long as Germany doesn't really have this, often announced but never actually materialized U-turn in their foreign and domestic policy, this is not going to change. So I think, as you guys correctly point out, whatever the headlines say, whatever the Sunday speeches by politicians are, I think the underlying indicators still strongly point towards not just Germany, I would say all of Europe, kind of being at least economically very, very benevolent towards China. And I think sooner or later, with the exception of some Eastern and Central European countries, I think many Europeans would be more than happy to renormalize relations with Russia as much as possible.
Yeah. Let's get on that later. Ross, okay, before we move on, what do you see in supply chains that people aren't talking about that we need to know about? What is a thing where you're just like, gosh, why don't people see this? What is that with supply chains?
It's food. It's probably the biggest and most obvious one that comes to mind. Particularly, everyone's talking about semiconductors. That's an obvious one too, but that gets beat to death. And frankly, the U.S. really holds some major strategic advantages with that as well, that don't get discussed enough when we talk about that issue. On the food side, though, particularly with regards to China and Russia, Russia is an enormous manufacturer of certain fertilizers. That's very true. Now, the U.S. has tremendous optionality with Canada next door. We make a tremendous amount of nitrogen. We have the ability to make more. We do find for ourselves on phosphates. We have significant phosphate reserves. On the potash side, Canada has far and away the most reserves in the world and an untapped capacity to move more to the U.S. So I don't subscribe at least as far as like Europe and the U.S. are concerned, to the macro, nutrient issue of NP and K that you've heard, recently and for long term elsewhere, that Russia and China control the world on that. They don't. We do find on fertilizers. Amino acids are an enormous issue, vitamins and micronutrients. And those are the ones where, when you're talking about, there's roughly 10 major vitamins that go into animal and human nutrition, but particularly into animal feed to keep them alive, to help them grow faster, to help them produce higher quality meat and eggs and milk. Almost all of those vitamins are 90% or more manufactured in China, most of them at 100%. When you talk about key minerals that needs to go into their diets, whether it's zinc, calcium, or you see sometimes manganese and magnesium added in as well. Other than Turkey, India, and Brazil, most of that stuff comes from China too. And then you talk about the big amino acids. The U.S. is far and away the largest meat producer in the world per capita, even more so than China. But we make about 40% of the amino acids needed in the diet. So we make far and away adequate supplies of DDGs or soybean meal that we use as the crude protein and the crude fiber. But the other 20% of that is almost completely controlled by China, and then BASF and one other company based in Switzerland. And so if they turned off the tap on that, I hope to God that she's not watching this. If they turned off the tap on that, it would be crushing for our food sector.
So is there anybody who's talking about rotating that production elsewhere? Any companies making that?
ADM and Cargill talk about it because they're the only ones that actually make the stuff in the U.S. In ADM's case, they manufacture in-house. In Cargill's case, they're actually the glucose or dextrose stream that gets fed into that fermentation cycle to make aminos. You have Evonik in Blair, Nebraska. You've got two companies in Iowa, Korean and Japanese, and that's CJ and International and Ajinomoto. They are also an over-the-fence agreement with next to Cargill corn mills. That's it, really, as far as that type of product in the U.S. we could expand that capacity relatively rapidly. But we have seen amino acids in particular go through so many expansion, contraction, volatility cycles that to an American company, particularly one that's, publicly owned one like ADM, the juice isn't there for them. They're not going to take a 20-year investment risk on something that on a year-to-year basis can lose a lot of money.
Okay, but if they had to, how long would it take to get that up and running?
It takes less than 2 years to build a wet corn mill. But if you were to expand fermentation capacity at any of the already existing wet corn mills in the US that are making, let's say, high fructose corn syrup, I think of Golden Growers, which is a 50% joint venture with Cargill up in the southeastern corner of North Dakota. All they're making up there is high fructose corn syrup for food. They could easily convert that stream into fermentation inside 12 months or less. So we do have a dormant, quick to market capacity, relatively speaking. The faster we could get that type of thing online, you could do it with subsidies, you could do it with some market protections, you could do it in the food bill, and just add certain things in there that favor that type of production. So these are not unsolvable problems. Vitamins, we're, pardon the language, if China really does decide to cut us off on that, that becomes very problematic in a hurry, because it's 3 to 5 years to get vitamin production online. If you're talking synthetic vitamin production, all of that is adjacent and utilizes co-product from the petrochemical industry.
Okay, so when I hear this stuff, it makes me wonder, with all of the money that the federal government puked out in 20 and 21 and early 22, this seems like a relatively small investment. And
yeah, it's very small. A couple $1 billion to build a massive vitamin plant. Yeah, you could co-locate a vitamin plant right next to Port Arthur, any of the places that are along the Gulf that are very dense in natural gas. And within 24 to 36 months, depending on permitting, if you put a fast lane in place, you could do it in 24 months. And the expertise exists in the US to build that.
Okay, thanks for that frustrating example, but it's something we need to talk about, right? And people need to know about it. So thanks for that.
Albert will tell you this, that it's not talked about much in DC. I've briefed numerous Senate committees over the last year on this, a couple of House committees, a whole lot of staff members and congressmen, to their faces. And I show them the charts, I show them the numbers, and it's really outside of anybody who's part of the Midwestern congressional delegations. They have no idea. It's completely foreign to them. And it's really one of our pacing strategic risks.
Yeah, they're like deer in headlights when you start bringing up these complex issues with supply chains and asymmetrical responses that the Chinese hold against us. It's just, nothing. No, it just doesn't register.
Yeah, it's terrible. Okay, thank you, Ross. So, Albert, let's move over to you. And I want to, since we are talking about China, let's talk about a Twitter discussion that you and Ross had last week, where you invited him on the podcast to talk about some of Peter Zeihan's comments about China. So just so everyone knows, I tried to connect with Peter Zeihan on Twitter and invite him to come on, but he's very popular and we're really small time for him. So I don't blame him for not coming on. But anyway,
he just doesn't want to be challenged, maybe.
Well, possibly. Yeah. I mean, look, the guy is a great speaker. And when I watch him speak, I wish I could speak that well, right? He's obviously very smart, and he says some stuff that sounds really impressive, big bold predictions, all that stuff. So, having said all of that, he was on Joe Rogan last week and talked about China, and basically said that China won't exist in 10 years, right? Now, this, to be honest, is a derivative of George Friedman's hypothesis in a book called The Next 100 Years that was published in 2009, where Friedman said that China would split into, I think, 5 countries, part of it owned by Japan, part of it, whatever. It's a really interesting book where he talks about a resurgent Turkey, a stronger Mexico, all that stuff. I definitely recommend that to people. Some of the stuff doesn't sound real, but directionally it's interesting. But Albert, both you and Ross have opinions on this, and you can talk about any of the stuff that Peter Zeihan said. But I guess broadly, do you see China as a nation state by 2033?
Of course I do. It's an absurd comment to say that it's going to break apart within 10 years. I mean, you'd have to have something cataclysmic to break up a major industrial nation into ceasing to exist. That's just I don't understand how that could possibly even come to fruition. I mean, China has, you know, a strong economic growth. They've brought up a middle class. They have a CCP that's a centralized government that can, you know, initiate policies and stimulate the economy at will. They have a grasp on the country. They have a good grasp on the population. Everything that you see, you know, that comes out of these protests or whatnot, you know, that's something that the politicians in China allow you to see, and it's a messaging thing. I was on here, what is it, like a month ago with the Atlantic Council guys, and they're, you know, about the COVID lockdowns and whatnot. And I said, this is your signal that China's opening, and literally, I think it was like a week later they opened. You know, the thing is, people look at China and they take things at face value, what politicians and what data that comes out of China at face value. And it's just, you simply cannot do that. You know, as much as we, you know, blast the Chinese for their Belt and Road Initiative, the key component of that is they have food security coming through that. They have farmlands in Africa. They have meat coming through the South American border. And even if we were to cut off their meat supply by some measure or another, they still can fish the Sea of Japan that has 5% of the world's fish. So they have options for, you know, feeding their population in a pinch, and they have the stability and the military and the police force to keep the people in line. So I don't see how you know, barring a meteor hitting the place, you know, or barring some kind of like supercharged COVID starting to kill, you know, millions and millions of Chinese people, I don't see how it's even possible, even logical to say that it can end up, you know, ceasing to exist in 10 years. I mean, just the asymmetrical, you know, challenges that the world would have to bring China down if they tried to would be devastating for the global economy.
Yeah, Ross, what do you think there?
Yeah, I think if almost every discussion about the demise of China ignores one simple thing, and that's that not unique to communists. Will to power is certainly very, very, you know, baked into the cake when you're talking about communism. But in terms of strategic optionality, China's done a better job than any communist country ever at reinforcing their flanks strategically in a lot of different ways. And so you have to account for that. You have to account for the agency, you know, again, of the adversary, which I think a lot of the discussions about the decline of China do not account for. It at least makes it incredibly complex, and certainly is by no means is anything certain one way or the other. On the demographic time bomb issue, I have a very cold-hearted way to say this. I don't think they care. I don't think they care. When you look at an enormous number of people that are, on the one hand, potentially would die off in some sort of food shortage, certainly with the reopening, the percentage of people that at least from the people I talk to and deal with in China on a daily basis, it's not a lot of young people. It's not a lot of the productive workforce. Again, just like in the US, it's a lot of people that are unhealthy or older or both. And so you're talking about people that already have significant respiratory issues in the cities, then getting hit with any sort of cold that's beyond a basic cold. It's going to be a problem for them, right? So even if they survive, you're still talking about a percentage of the population that in the communist mentality are viewed as less productive or drains on the state's resources. They don't really care if a lot of these people die. They truly don't. And some level of very minor famine, where they have the ability to begin to marshal resources and shepherd them a certain way, where they can even target who wins and who dies. That type of thing we will see in that sort of scenario. And they will be able to almost indefinitely put on, not indefinitely, but for a much longer period of time, be able to put off the more severe impacts of a demographic time bomb. And the other issue is, of course, too, they're atheistic, right? They don't recognize Christianity or a Jewish God or an Islamic God or whatever. So they're really unbound by any sort of traditional moral or ethical constraints that we have in the West. And so who knows what sorts of technology, what sorts of medical procedures and things they're pursuing that will, in addition to things like automation, they're now one of the top 15 most automated manufacturing economies. A lot of the robots in the world have shifted production to China from Europe. So they're dealing with things in a way that all these other models talk about the demographic time bomb don't account for. They're going to be a smaller population, but I think long term that also may be baked into their calculus or even serve the interests of what they're looking towards.
Absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself, Ross. I mean, the Chinese are pragmatic. They don't make foolish mistakes when it comes to their existence. You know, they went out and bought grains for a year and a half. They went out and, you know, secured meat for a year and a half. They took advantage of the Ukraine war and secured energy supplies for a year and a half. I mean, they're not some kind of, you know, blind entity that's going to be taken by surprise. They know their challenges. They understand these problems. You know, there's something that, you know, it's just not simply, it's not a simple, you know, the population goes down, they're in trouble, they cease to exist. Those dots, I just can't connect.
Sorry, Ralph, you had some comments?
Yeah, just I fully agree with what Albert and Ross said, and I think the demographic part, what is often overlooked. I mean, imagine you are the dictator, right? You are Xi. I mean, what kind of population would you like to have? One that is on average in the early 20s, or one that's on average in the late 30s or early 40s? I think an older population is easier to control because, I mean, we see this in, you know, the Middle East and in Palestine and these areas. It's young men who are the biggest problem for social stability. So if we can find this, you know, golden middle ground of late 30s, early 40s, I think that actually could be to the advantage of the stability of the political system. The only thing, because Ross, you mentioned the religion part. I mean, I don't know if this is still true. It was definitely true a couple of years ago, right? That China had the fastest growing Christian minority in the world. So that doesn't matter if it doesn't penetrate the political system, right? The political leadership. I'd be curious. That's kind of the only scenario where I would see major changes if all of a sudden, right, kind of these ideas, for whatever reason, start to penetrate the inner circle of Chinese leadership, you know, in a kind of a ancient Roman scenario where all of a sudden the Roman Empire became Christian in an exaggerated fashion. But otherwise, I think you guys are completely right. I think the rumors of China's immediate demise are strongly exaggerated.
Yeah, let me add a couple things here. I think when people make comments about the demise of China, I don't think they understand modern Chinese history. If you look from, say, the mid-50s until today, certainly, well, I guess the 19-teens until today, right? The volatility that you've seen in China's social structures, the conflict you've seen, the famines you've seen, the deaths you've seen, and certainly in the CCP area, the tolerance that the population has had for leadership, whether that's coercive tolerance or whether that's genuine tolerance, you know, they have tolerated a lot. Okay. Now, so when we look at, I think part of the pressure on the CCP, maybe not China as a nation state, but the CCP as a ruling party is, through much of the CCP's existence, the population was very poor, okay, and not very educated. And this was, Deng Xiaoping was really the one who to say, hey, we need an educated leadership, because until then, most of the people kind of dumb and not really well educated. And a lot of the universities were closed down in the 60s, right? And so they really started having this educated leadership in the 80s and an educated business class starting in the 90s, right? And so you now have a very widespread level of education, and you have a pretty widespread communications platform where people can understand what life is like in other parts of the world. And so, you know, I do think that there will be more pressure put onto the CCP to open up and to do things like respect individual rights, whether that's Christian or not. It's something that with wealth comes an expectation that individual rights are respected, right? And so if somehow there was some sort of economic regression where people were poor again, fine, but that would make people really angry. But as people get more wealthy and as they get more educated, I think that does put more pressure on the CCP to be more responsive to the population. Because in the past, people would go into their government guy or woman, and they didn't really have any ability to push back, say, intellectually necessarily, right? Now they can go into their government representative and go, oh, that person's stupid. They don't know what they're talking about. And we do that in the US and we do that in Europe, where we go, our politicians are stupid, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's happening more and more in China. And so I don't think that it leads to the demise of China as a nation state. I think it leads to heavy pressure to the CCP to evolve into something different. And I'm not sure what that is, but I think the pressure on the CCP to evolve will become immense over the next 5 to 6 years. And maybe that's what Zeihan meant. And he just kind of used simplified language. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, even, the CCP morphing into something slightly more liberal is obviously going to happen. I mean, Xi's actually done quite a good job promoting national unity, if you want to give him any sort of praise. National unity within China has risen over the past, 5 to 10 years. The CCP, like I said, they've been around for 70 years. Tony, you said that. They know what they've got a grip on the country, and I just don't see it releasing anytime soon under any circumstance.
Let me just go back and say one thing where I'll disagree with you. It's a rare moment of disagreement, Albert, but I actually think the CCP are terrible planners. They're terrible. They bought things for a year and a half at a time, but they're just terrible planners. And because they have such a heavy current account surplus, they have the money to make up for their mistakes, and that's been their situation for the past 30 years. But I think in general, central planning is horrific. And I think Chinese central planners are incredibly awful. So the belief, and I'm not accusing you of having this belief, but I think there is, among kind of Western intellectuals, there is a belief that Chinese are amazing planners and central planners. They're really thoughtful. And I think that's garbage because it's just not true. They make a lot of mistakes.
Oh, no question about that. When you start talking about like central planning and strategic moves, the Chinese have historically not been good. You're right. But those are like 20, 30 years out, right? But I'm talking about 4 or 5 years out. They usually don't make, mistakes when it comes to their own domestic politics within the country itself. I mean, they're still around 70 years. Nothing's changed really in 70 years. So in that respect, I would give them credit, say, hey, for national unity's sake, if they keep themselves in power, then they've done a good job. For everything else, they do a terrible job.
Yeah. I mean, again,
well, the dog not barking so much for China when people talk about this stuff is this is the first time we've ever seen any sort of synergy between the PLA and the CPC leadership. That there has historically been a significant, externally people don't realize it, but if you're in the game, you get it. There has always been a historical significant antagonism in a lot of ways between PLA senior leadership and the CPC, the political, the civilian mandarins, if you will. And this is the first time that we've ever seen, and going all the way back to Mao and before him, any sort of cohesion, whether it's enforced at the barrel of a gun or not, but cohesion because of all these corruption purges that Xi's been on since he took power in 2012, going all the way now to today. We're seeing for the first time really the output of a unified PLA CPC kind of mega deep state, if you will. And that gives for the first time the civilian side a lot more control over what has historically been a multi-trillion-dollar dark economy and revenue engine of China. And that's that massive network of shell companies and enterprises that the PLA owns through everything that they've got. And I'm not saying necessarily we can predict yet what this means. But if that cohesion, if that's some sort of, maybe for the first time, unity, if you will, from a political side and from a commercial side, we don't know what that's going to look like.
The more that happens, the more fragile that whole infrastructure becomes. It becomes so inflexible. And I think for the adversaries of China, that's a great thing. So go down that path as fast as they can, because it creates a very fragile infrastructure within the Chinese government.
I'm glad that Ross brought that up because I actually had a tweet thread today about something similar where Xi has been messing with the CMC, which is the PLA Navy's group that kind of operated away from the CCP and was instrumental in dialogue with the U.S. Navy. So now that he's like pretty much eliminated those leadership and starting to put his own people in there. So there's room for error when you just put civilians inside of like a military complex. So
that's the path that I would say if we see a decline of China as an actual like aspiring global hegemon, if you will, I think it's more likely to come from that vector than it would be any sort of demographic time bomb considerations.
Yeah.
I don't disagree with you. Okay, guys, let's move on to Germany. Ralph, you had sent a tweet earlier, I think you sent it a couple days ago, talking about the German energy mix and the push for clean energy in Germany, and how ultimately that will lead to more demand for Russian gas. Can you talk us through that hypothesis? I know you wrote a detailed thought piece about it. Can you talk us through that and then help us understand when the Russia-Ukraine war stops, how long before Germany goes kind of rushing into Russian gas again?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first and most important takeaway is that the underlying German energy strategy has not changed despite the war in Ukraine. And maybe just to sum it up a little bit, in 2021, where we have the most recent numbers, right, about 40% of German electricity production came from coal and nuclear, all kinds of coal, so lignite and black coal. And they want to phase that out in the next 10 years. Actually, coal, they want to phase out now faster than originally planned. So that means they have to replace 40% of their electricity production. But at the same time, until 2030, the expectation is by German industry that they will have an increase in 20% of demand. And what is the German plan to kind of meet the replacing the lost coal and nuclear and meeting this new demand of 20%? The plan was always gas-fired power plants. And that plan is still in place. So they still want to double their gas-fired power plants. And of course, the question is, where's the gas going to come from? Now, the quick answer is always, it's going to be US LNG. But I think this is just going to be an affordability problem at some point. The Germans spent $440 billion only for energy-related matters this year. Just to give you a comparison, the entire EU spent $700 billion as the so-called relief package for COVID. So just to give you the dimension, we're just talking about Germany here. So this is not sustainable. That's 12% of their growth, of their domestic industrial output. So they cannot do this forever. And secondly, kind of as a more geopolitical thing, I think they prefer close cooperation with Russia than being dependent either on the US or being dependent on Italy or Spain and these areas where LNG would also come through. So I think that on the medium to long run, if there is a window of opportunity to reopen the gas flow from Russia, which is of course still going on through other pipelines, I think they will jump on it. And the last point, which I find quite intriguing, because everybody says, Nord Stream 2, Nord Stream 1, it was sabotaged by the Americans. But apparently, if you look at it, one pipeline of the Nord Stream 2 net is still operational. So to me, this looks more, if I would speculate, and of course I'm speculating here, is that the Russians say, no, we cannot destroy Nord Stream 1, we leave a bit of Nord Stream 2 in place, because then we have to start at some point Nord Stream 2. And then kind of when this is already happening, we just also start Nord Stream 1 again once it's repaired, because that was always in place. So I think the underlying energy outlook is still the same. And I think as soon as there is a ceasefire or something, this is going to happen. And the very last point, we talk a lot about gas, but of course there's still the unanswered diesel question when it comes to energy between Russia and Europe. So as I said, I think if there is a chance to re-engage in the energy market with the Russians, I think Germany primarily, but I think other Europeans as well would be very happy if they could re-engage in this area with Russia.
Perfect. Ross, I'm going to stop you real quick. And I know Ross has to jump in a couple of minutes. Ross, what thoughts do you have on that, on Germany's dependence on Russian gas?
I think it's obvious. If you work in the commercial world, if you deal with German companies, whether as a buyer or a seller or a supplier, whatever it may be, I do think you're seeing a play out the clock scenario here. There is obviously positive alignment at a global scale between Russia and China, and there's disagreements or things where maybe one surprises the other with some of their behaviors, but in general, they're positively aligned. Major German manufacturers doubling down in China is actually, I think, an adjacent indicator. Russia is still the cheapest source of natural gas that Germany itself can get its hands on. And it's not, I say this somewhat facetiously, but also sincerely, it's not like the Germans and the Russians don't have a history of secret relationships,
or conflict.
That benefit maybe them, or conflict.
Right.
So I do think that as long as there is a strategic alignment on a long-term basis of Germany and through infrastructure and through, relationships that have really been built deeply since the end of the Cold War, connection to Russia, I think it would take a lot to really completely sever that completely, because it would, on a long-term basis, it would, if they don't have replacement energy capacity, which they don't, not at this point, Germany would stand to be tremendously disrupted by that. I don't think they're going to let it happen. Not for NATO, not for the EU.
And maybe to add something, since Ross is still here as a supply guy, the other thing is even the idea they would have to double their renewables, including wind and solar. And the problem is wherever they can build those wind turbines, they cannot get those transmission lines built basically from the north to the industrial heart, or in Bavaria, for example. One hand is because the lines are too expensive and too long at the moment, and the other thing is nobody wants them in their neighborhood, right? This is, nobody talks about this. So on paper, it's easy to build them, but every little, municipality, every local politician says, sure, you can make those transition lines, but not here. And then this has basically been on ice for a long time now. So as Ross also says, I think at some point it's either, continue spending oodles of money, which at some point I think will just get too expensive, or find ways either openly or secretly to increase imports in the energy sector from Russia.
Yep. Ross, I know you have to jump. I just want to thank you for your time. We're going to continue the conversation, but I look forward to having you on again. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Thanks, gentlemen.
Thanks, Ross.
Take care,
Ross,
guys.
one of the things you said was that Germany would rather source gas from Russia than from Southern Europe. Can you help us understand why that's the case?
Yeah, because I think this is one thing that has been overlooked in the entire debate when it comes to the Russian position. It's also true a little bit for the French position, that a shift towards the East in focus, both economically and politically, is not in Germany's interest. So as many are, I say now, fantasizing, but I don't mean it in a disrespectful way, of a new kind of, Baltic, Polish, Ukrainian alliance under the military protection, let's say, or military cooperation with the UK and the US. That is not something that Germany is particularly interested in, because they want to remain the major power in Central and Eastern Europe. And kind of a new formed bloc with 44 million Ukrainians is not something that they are particularly interested in. And the same is true with kind of shifting the energy focus, let's say, towards Italy or towards Southern Europe. It's the same thing. I think this is not the kind of power shift that they want to see. And just as a quick add-on to this is often forgotten. Germany, together with the Czech Republic as a smaller player, and particularly France, they have been the major electricity exporter in Europe. So they, in some cases, quite literally had the hand on the light switch. And I think this is also something that Germany doesn't want to lose. Now, I don't know to what extent they are aware of this themselves, but I think if you look at German behavior towards Ukraine, towards Russia, in this entire conflict, even now at the moment, right, where they say, yeah, we might deliver main battle tanks if the US delivers them first, and if the Polish deliver them first, then maybe we'll do it as well. I mean, I think this hesitancy is not just facetiousness on part of the Germans. I think it is kind of being concerned that the power could shift further towards the east into this, kind of Polish, Baltic, Ukrainian new power center. It would be economically weaker, but it's already militarily potentially significantly stronger. So I think Germany is playing a kind of geopolitical game here that is not, we can have a moral debate whether we agree or disagree, but I think from what they're trying to accomplish, it's at least partially understandable. And as a truly last point, there was a moment, if they would have really kind of switched entirely their energy policy in February, right, continuing the nuclear power plants and shifting other areas, I think then it would have been credible that they say they want to kind of emancipate from Russian energy, from Russian gas, but they didn't do anything of that kind. So this is why I think that on the long run, on the medium to long run, relations between Russia and Germany will improve, whatever that means for other players.
I think it's so interesting, the Polish, Baltic, Ukrainian, that is such an ancient political entity from centuries ago, right? And so it's just interesting that these things are coming back. I want to push a little bit harder on that in as much as you say they would rather source from Russia than from Southern Europe. Why are they so hesitant to source gas from Southern Europe? Because it's a part of the EU. It wouldn't be a political kind of lever that the South would pull. So why?
No, it is. It would be, Tony. It would be, because the Germans have, the Spain and Italy is indebted to Germany significant amounts of. right? So that upsets the political dynamic from the Germans being able to counter the French. And what are they doing within the EU? So you have a political economic dynamic here where Germany just does not want to give money back to the Italians and the Spanish.
Okay, so what you're saying is Germany would rather empower a hostile Russia and rather enrich a hostile Russia than give up the political power that they have over the South by giving them money. They would rather have the thumb on Southern Europe and control them politically than actually help enrich their fellow Europeans.
Yeah, I mean,
I wasn't aware of this. Europe. I used to pay attention to Europe 20 years ago. I don't as much anymore.
I would do the same thing, because Russia is not in my political sphere, right? And there is little to zero chance that the Russians are going to attack NATO lands. So from the German perspective, I get cheap power from party A, and I still control party B and C over here under my thumb. Why would I change that dynamic? I would never do that.
The German area or the German sphere of interest that they are interested in is central, is Europe, or it's the European Union. They don't really care what's going on in further to the east, or for example between Russia and Ukraine, which they have shown quite openly up until February. I think Albert is precisely on the money here. So this was a very good deal for Germany.
Wow. Just another reason for me to think that the EU, as I've thought for the last 30 years, is just a cynical political grouping rather than a functional, union. It's very simple for Germany.
Nation states have their own interests at heart always, first and foremost, before you want to talk about globalist or community.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Okay, guys, this has been great. Can you just, before we kind of end this, can you guys help us think, what are you looking at, let's say for the rest of January, kind of the week ahead, the next couple of weeks ahead? What are you guys looking at with, say, ECB or Fed or markets? Like, what are the things that are on your mind right now that you're looking at for the next week?
I don't know about the next week. I think OPEX is next week, so it'll probably be pretty muted before the Fed in February. But honestly, I'm looking at Russia, whether or not they desire to have a new surge into Ukraine, albeit a smaller one, more tactical. But they need a win for the PR that they're before they actually try to come into like actual peace negotiations, because it's just not sustainable what they're doing right now.
So do you think there will be peace negotiations, say, in March, April, something like that? Plausible, at least?
June, July, maybe.
June, July. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Ralph?
I'm kind of looking at the German economic numbers at the moment, because they have all been very celebratory, because in the fourth quarter, apparently it grew by 1.9%. My suspicion is that these numbers were particularly pushed because Germany was simply pumping so much money into the economy. This is something, Albert, you mentioned this a couple of times on your Twitter feed as well. This is something I don't think enough people talk about, that whatever the ECB does, right, a lot of this is going to be offset by European programs of pumping money into the system, via alternative means. So kind of the celebratory mood that now it's, I think, also, just 7.7% inflation and not 10% inflation. I think that's just going to be temporary. And the same is about economic growth. So this idea that there will not be, as I think Goldman Sachs cited and a couple of other economists as well, that there will not be a recession in Europe next year, I'll be very surprised. I mean, I prefer not to be the one, but at some point, I know, Albert has said something similar once, but I'm growing increasingly suspicious of these numbers, because they don't add up with anything. When you talk to people in the industry, when you talk to the banking sector, they tell you it's not all doom and gloom, but it's definitely not next year we're going to grow, beyond our expectations.
Yeah, the celebratory chants for the Europeans right now completely miss the fact that they're dormant. They're in a zombie state. There's nothing going on in Europe at the moment. Yeah. So once they start kicking things back up in manufacturing and demand, inflation is going to go right back up to where it was a year ago.
Yeah, I never trust a preliminary economic data release. Never. You always wait for the second or third revision. So when markets move on a preliminary release, it's moving on the belief that other people have expectations around it, right? And so It's just this reflective, expectations-based move rather than based on the numbers themselves. So, and I often say this on my Twitter feed, like, wait for the revision. Don't trust the initial preliminary data release because it is PR. It's nothing more than PR. Maybe it's directionally correct, maybe. But those preliminary releases are PR. So on that optimistic note, guys, I want to thank you for your time. This has been fantastic. We've had such a great, deep discussion. So thanks very much. Have a great weekend and have a great week ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony.
Thanks, Tony.
Ralph.